and Lily and Yoshan and the other fellows that have so graciously hosted us here at Gustavo and I this week. It's been a fabulous week and a great end with this conference. So thank you for the invitation to talk. I'm going to take a completely different direction than you just heard from Francesco, is that there's also a group of older adults who are overnourished. And I've been privileged to work with Dennis Villarreal in the US, working on some clinical trials, looking at how we can do lifestyle interventions with frail, obese, older adults. And it was very timely this morning. I received an email from a colleague from Wellington, New Zealand, saying that we're about to put in, or she was about to put in a position paper to the government saying that we have a real problem in New Zealand with morbidly obese, very, very obese, older people who are frail, who need to go into aged residential care, which are our nursing homes in New Zealand. And the aged residential care facilities are not set up to deal with these kind of patients. So they're actually having the patients go back and being cared for by the families. But the families are not in a position to take care of them either. And I know Eve Rowland reported this in Europe a number of years ago, and we certainly see this kind of problem in the US. So it is a problem, and obesity in older adults is increasing as people live longer. So hopefully today you'll take away some messages on how we might treat these people who are frail and obese. So what I'm going to be presenting today are a couple of clinical trials that were run in the US. And the initial trials that were run worked well. People did lose weight, they did improve their function, they did reduce their frailty. However, there was quite significant loss of bone mass and muscle mass in response to these treatments, which raised some safety concerns. So the later trials we did again with a diet, what we call lifestyle intervention with nutrition and exercise. So we added aerobic plus resistance exercise, and that seemed really quite effective in improving functional status when they were actively losing weight. It also mitigated some of the loss of bone and muscle, but didn't entirely stop it. And interestingly, and what I'll show you in this data today, is this combination of aerobic and resistance exercise, rather than aerobic exercise alone or resistance exercise alone, was the most effective in improving physical function. So this trial was run in St. Louis, Missouri, and it was funded by the National Institutes of Health. It was run between around 2005 and 2009. And this followed on from a couple of smaller trials that Dr. Villarreal had conducted, showing this kind of weight loss was impacting negatively on muscle and bone, despite the fact that people were functioning better. So he wanted to go in and see if whether or not that adding exercise would augment the improvement of the physical functioning outcomes that we're measuring, as well as attenuate the negative effects of weight loss on muscle and bone. So in these clinical trials, we don't use sarcopenia cut scores, we use BMI. And the reason we do that is it's easy to screen lots of people, and we still do pick up people who are obese. And then they are tested for being frail. And I'll show you what we use that for. So the participants in all of these trials, or the two trials I'm going to show you, have a BMI of over 30 to get screened into the study. And then they have evidence of physical frailty. They're over the age of 65. They're sedentary. They've been stable weight and on stable medications for at least 6 months. And then they are excluded for a number of medical conditions that would be not conducive to putting them in what's reasonably intensive exercise intervention. So physical frailty, the evidence of physical frailty. For this particular trial, we used 2 of the 3 of these types of markers of physical performance test, which we have really good retest reliability in the lab. VO2 peak, a graded exercise, treadmill walking, and a functional status questionnaire, an FSQ, which is self-report of people who feel that they're having difficulty with their activities of daily living or instrumental activities of daily living. So I'll go through, and this is pretty much the same intervention that we used in the second trial that I'll show you. All of the people who were put into the intervention for the weight loss were on an energy deficit of around 500 to 750 kilocalories a day. They were also made sure to have an ADA, or an American Dietetics Association type of diet, so it was a well-balanced diet, 1 gram per kilogram body weight high quality protein per day, and then they were supplemented with vitamin D at 1,000 units per day and calcium. The goal for the weight loss for this particular trial, which was a year intervention, was to lose 10% of their total body weight over a year period. But we didn't want them losing weight too quickly, so they were monitored quite regularly every week and kept that weight loss to 1.5% body weight maximum per week. So they came into the clinic every week, met with a nutritionist who reviewed their dietary records, made sure they were eating properly, made sure they were on track, and worked with them to make sure they were actually being supported with the things they needed to do to stick with this program. So they had goal setting, self-monitoring, stimulus control, problem solving, and relapse prevention. And they did this in a group. So this was group activities as well as individual screening and a review of their nutritional records. Now some of you may be surprised, thinking these are 65 plus frail, sedentary older adults in this kind of an exercise training program, but they all who were randomized to it were able to do it. So these training sessions were held in a purpose-built facility, generally in a hospital. So it's an actual gym that was built into this grant that was built in St. Louis and also in Albuquerque. They would come in 3 non-consecutive days a week. They would go through this training routine, which was 15 minutes of flexibility exercises, 30 minutes of endurance, and that would be on a treadmill, a cycle ergometer, or a bike elliptical trainer. You can see that they were working at 80%, so they didn't start at 80%, that would have been too high, that they were worked up and progressed over a period of months to up to 80% of their VO2 peak. That was the goal. So that's quite an intensive exercise. They did 30 minutes of resistance training, which was on machines, so they weren't doing free weights, but they were all supervised. Again, getting monitored by 1 repetition maximums, working up to 80% of a 1 repetition max. And the cool down was 15 minutes of balance. They were always supervised in their training sessions by a physical therapist or an exercise physiologist. The primary outcome for this trial was the PPT. We also measured those other FSQ and the VO2 peak, measured 1 repetition max for strength, gait speed, static balance, and dynamic balance. Body composition, we had both DEXA and MRI scans. We looked at bone turnover markers in the blood. And then the smaller font outcomes are things that were also collected, which I'm not going to talk about today. They had a subgroup had muscle biopsies to look at muscle protein synthesis, whole body proteolysis, inflammatory cytokines, and health-related quality of life. But I won't present those data today. So for this particular trial, we screened about 230 people. 107 were randomized into those 4 treatment arms, so diet alone, exercise alone, which was a combination of aerobic and resistance exercise, and then a combination of diet plus aerobic and resistance exercise. The control group was coming in monthly and getting education about nutrition and exercise, but didn't have any interventions or nutritional kinds of checkups. So, it worked. The NIH, when they originally funded this research, they thought, well, are you even going to get people to achieve this kind of goal? And we showed that people can. These people who are frail and sedentary can actually go into a year-long program and have a 10% drop in their total body weight over that period. So that was in the diet and exercise groups. The group that wasn't dieting, the exercise group, maintained their weight, as well as the control group maintained their weight. We had a busy graph, but I'll walk you through it. So this particular graph is looking at the physical performance test. So you can see the diet and exercise had quite a significant increase at 6 months, which they continued to increase up to 12 months. Not quite as much of an increase in the exercise, but certainly had a significant increase in the PPT. Diet had also increased in their physical functioning, and control didn't really change. Then we have the VO2 peak. Again, the biggest change was in the diet and exercise group. And the diet alone and exercise alone were indistinguishable. They did improve at 6 months, but didn't really improve much beyond that. Nothing in the control. And that questionnaire about how people felt about their functioning was again highest in the diet and exercise, followed by exercise, and then diet, and no change in control. So this is an MRI scan of a person, with the same person who came in at 95 kgs, ended up being 75 kgs. This was a diet alone, so this person was not exercising, they were just on the diet intervention. So they lost a significant amount of weight, as we had hoped. Doesn't even look like the same leg, but it is. This is their subcutaneous fat loss, 30%. They lost 10% in their lean body mass. So surprisingly, they went from being moderately frail to almost maxing out the tests. So their function really improved, and their relative lean body mass also improved. So despite the fact that they'd lost lean body mass, their function had actually improved. But they had lost quite a lot of lean body mass, so that's not really what you want to see happening. This is a person, a participant who came in who was doing the exercise plus the weight loss. They came in also at 90 kgs, went down to 82, 18% loss of the subcutaneous fat, but gained 4% of lean body mass. They were started out actually more frail. They were quite frail at a score of 25, and again, almost maxed out the test. So that was probably what you'd say, oh, that's a little better result, that they didn't really lose so much lean body mass, they had a greater increase in their function. You can ignore that top graph, that's just the weight again. If we look at insulin sensitivity, that's a pretty impressive improvement in insulin sensitivity in that diet and exercise group that continued to improve all the way out to 12 months. The dieting group also had a significant improvement that plateaued out at 6 months, and the control group and the exercise group didn't really change their insulin sensitivity much. This is another one that's pretty impressive. Again, we've already, this is visceral fat. So we saw quite significant decreases within the exercise group, but the diet group had an even greater, and the diet and exercise had quite a large decrease in their visceral fat. We already talked about lean body mass, which was greatest in that loss, was greatest in the dieting group. And if you look at that metabolic syndrome prevalence in the diet plus exercise group, and that shows what was going on with the insulin sensitivity marker as well, huge decrease in the proportion of people who had any markers of metabolic syndrome. Now, this was kind of why we were looking at these particular interventions, was this loss of bone. So this is hip bone mineral density and bone turnover, so it's C-teleopeptide. So if you look at this is percent change in hip bone mineral density, the group that was dieting alone, no exercise, lost almost 2% of hip bone mineral density, whereas the group that was exercising alone, not dieting, actually gained almost 1.5%. When we had the diet and exercise combined, it mitigated, kind of slowed, not quite as big of a change or drop in that bone mineral density, but it didn't stop it. And if you look at this, it almost looks like a flipped image, that this is the C-teleopeptide in the group that was dieting. That was also significantly increased in that dieting group, driving that bone turnover as well as less in the exercise group. Again, diet plus exercise, not quite as big of an increase in the bone turnover as we saw in dieting alone. And this just shows more bone turnover markers. This is C-teleopeptide in the top, osteocalcin, and the PNIP. And again, if you look at the dieting group, this is showing it more across the time frame rather than at the 1-year marker increase, which really stayed pretty high up to 12 months, somewhat mitigated in the diet and exercise, actually decreasing in the exercise group. And that's a pretty consistent pattern that you see across, that the decreasing these bone turnover markers in the exercise group, and the dieting is driving those bone turnover markers to increase. This is also showing the hip geometry. So this is looking at, if you look at the bars that are in the yellow, which kind of stand out against everything else. So if you look at the trochanter, the neck of the femur, the trochanter, and the femoral shaft, pretty clear that in the groups that are just doing the diet alone, again, are seeing these much bigger markers of bone turnover and decrease in these markers of cross-sectional areas, section modulus, cortical thickness, and buckling ratio. So it did appear that weight loss was impairing not only bone mineral density, but also bone geometry, but that exercise, which is in the red bar, which are all above the graph, or above the line here, actually helped to mitigate that change. Now, when I was working, this was when we were actually doing the trial in Albuquerque, and I started talking to Dr. Villarreal, and I said, well, what happens to these people after the trials? So it's always important to know what people are doing after they've been in this trial. And so we decided to call back the people who were only in the diet and exercise groups. They would come back and let us take some measurements and see how they were doing. Now, I will preface this by saying we probably got a bit of a biased group. We don't know the people who didn't come back if they weren't successful in maintaining their weight loss, but certainly the people that we got coming back. So here they are at the beginning of the trial, 6 months, 12 months, 30 months later with no interventions, no contact from any of us until we contacted them at 30 months and said, would you come back? They've actually maintained some of that body weight loss. Not all of it, but they didn't go bouncing up above it, which is what you often hear reported in the literature. Probably even more surprisingly is that they had this significant increase in their physical performance test that we saw, and then they actually maintained that pretty well. And when we asked them what were they doing at that time, they said, well, I'm still exercising, I'm weighing myself a lot, I'm watching what I eat. So we'd actually changed their behavior long term, which was really quite exciting to think about as far as translation of this kind of research from clinical to more community-based. Again, what we saw, this is again the weight, which you've seen before, which they've done, but unfortunately we saw a continuing decline in hip bone mineral density. We aren't positive, it is possible that they aren't able to maintain that kind of intensive exercise or their diets changed somewhat. We weren't able to get to the real detail around that, but that's certainly something we'd like to follow up with the groups that we're conducting the research currently. So from this particular trial, we were able to show that actually, yes, these kind of frail, obese, older adults can go through a significant weight loss of 10%. It's achievable for them in that year time. And that we can see that with the weight loss and regular exercise, that they do increase physical functioning, so they decrease their frailty. They have improvements in body composition, like quality of life, which I didn't report, cardiovascular risk, and also cognition improved, which I also did not report. So we reported in this particular trial that the combined weight loss and exercise provided greater improvement in physical function than interventions alone, than dieting alone or exercise alone. However, this led to the second trial because we didn't know which exercise was really going to be the best, because our exercise intervention was a combination of aerobic and resistance exercise. So went back and we wanted to look at whether or not we could actually tease out this kind of difference with what's going on between aerobic and resistance exercise. And our hypothesis for this particular project was that we thought the physical performance test was going to significantly improve most in the weight loss and resistance exercise training group. This was funded between 2009 and 2015. It was conducted in Albuquerque, New Mexico, so we had another facility that was purpose-built at the VA hospital in Albuquerque. Again, using the same inclusion-exclusion criteria. Again, similar interventions, although these interventions were slightly different, so the exercise was similar and the resistance training was similar in what people were doing. However, the difference in this trial was that everyone but the control group was weight loss. And we did have a query on this from one of the reviewers of an article that's in press now about why we didn't use dieting as the control group. And we said, well, because of what we've seen so previously in our other trials, that dieting alone was really quite detrimental to bones, so we didn't use that kind of control group. So we had dieting plus aerobic exercise, so only aerobic exercise, bike, treadmill, cycle ergometer, and the step machine. Resistance training, again, using weight training, and the combination of the two, so combining. So this is what we had used before, the combination of the two, but we had to look at these two separately. Same kind of behavioral therapy that we used before, once a week. Calorie deficit of 500 to 750, 88 diet, protein intake is adequate, calcium and vitamin D intake. Similar outcomes, we had some different outcomes from this trial. We had, again, our physical performance test as our primary outcome measure, VO2 peak and gait speed. We also measured knee extension and flexion using the Biodex. We also, again, got visceral adipose tissue, and this time we also got intramuscular adipose tissue by MRI using a HIPAA and Mayo Clinic software. And we did also, again, insulin sensitivity, but used an index using the Medusa index. For this trial, we screened about almost 260 people, randomized 160. And again, they were equally divided into those 4 intervention groups of diet plus aerobic, diet plus resistance, or diet and a combination of aerobic and resistance. So baseline characteristics, you can see that we had people who had reasonably high BMIs, and they had PPT scores that were in the Frail, and then we had all the measures. So they were all, this is the randomized randomization schedule so that when they were properly randomized and there was no difference between the intervention groups at baseline. So again, looks like a similar kind of graph. We've got the control group, didn't change their weight. This is now a 6-month intervention rather than a year. And we show that the groups that were in the aerobic resistance and combination all had a 10% weight loss over that 6-month period. So I'll walk you through this one. So this again, this is our control, aerobic alone, resistance alone, combination of aerobic and resistance. So these 3 groups again are all dieting. We hypothesized that the PPT would increase the most in the resistance exercise. We were not correct. They actually increased the most in the combination group, even though this was equated for work volume. Interestingly, we had the VO2 peak, which shows that the work volume was really similar in both the aerobic resistance and the aerobic group, and a significant but not as large improvement in VO2 peak. Physical functioning questionnaire, again, the people who were in the combination group reported that they felt they were functioning better than the other 2 groups, although the other 2 groups did report improvement. And you can see the loss of lean body mass was about 4.5% in the group that was dieting and only doing aerobic exercise versus the group that was dieting and doing resistance exercise, and the group that was doing dieting and the combination aerobic resistance. We also found that the people that in this particular trial, again, we saw about a 2.5% loss of bone mineral density at the hip in the group that was dieting and doing aerobic exercise. And keep in mind, this aerobic exercise was not just out doing a strolling walk. This was quite intense, 80% of the VO2 peak 3 times a week for about an hour. And we saw that that was not as severe in the group that was doing resistance training, and also it got mitigated by the group of aerobic resistance. And strength training was, again, quite similar between the resistance and the combination resistance and aerobic. This is Dennis Villarreal's wife is an endocrinologist, and she's a bone specialist, and so she was looking at this in this particular trial, which has just been accepted for publication. Again, you can look at across all these different areas of the femoral neck, trochanter, intertrochanter, as we reported before, and across the board you can see that the group that is in the orange, aerobic, is having the most significant decreases in bone mineral density in those particular sites, not quite so much in the third radial distus. The lumbar spine's a bit of a funny one that we're not sure if that's actually a site-specific kind of response or if it's just osteophytes, which can be picked up as changes in bone mineral. But again, pointing out that with the people who are just dieting and doing aerobic exercise are showing quite significant decreases in bone mineral in the hip at multiple sites, which seems to get mitigated slightly by the combination of aerobic and resistance. So we wanted to think about what kind of predictors there might be. And so we looked at a range of different things: change in whole body mass, change in lean mass, change in the teleopeptide, the turnover marker, change in collagen markers, the change in osteocalcin, adiponectin, and leptin. And the only 2 that actually came out to be predictive of this change in total hip bone mineral density was the change in whole body mass and the change in leptin. And this is, again, another paper that we have in progress. This is looking at what's going on with the visceral fat that we collected. So we looked at thigh muscle mass, which again kind of mirrors what's going on in overall lean mass. So we saw that there was a significant drop again in the group that was doing dieting and aerobic versus a lesser change in the combination of resistance. Abdominal subcutaneous fat, that actually didn't change much between the 2 groups. It changed significantly, decreased across all the groups, despite having significant weight loss, but we couldn't really differentiate much change besides comparing it to control. Visceral adipose tissue in the abdomen, again, the greatest change was in that combination group of diet with aerobic and resistance. Lesser change, but still a significant change in the other 2 groups. Thigh subcutaneous tissue was dropping the most in the groups that were doing the diet and resistance, slightly less in the diet and control, and slightly different for the way that thigh intramuscular fat. So we saw, again, the greatest decrease in thigh intramuscular fat in the group that was doing the combined dieting resistance aerobic combination. And this slide shows you, again, looking at the insulin sensitivity index, seeing quite a big improvement in insulin sensitivity in the group that's doing the combination Again, a improvement in both resistance and combination, but not as large as what we saw with the combination. And this is just showing some correlations with the changes in visceral fat. So we've got insulin, so we've got change in visceral fat over insulin sensitivity, which was significant and moderately correlated. Change with VO2 peak, again, significant and moderately correlated. Weak correlations with with PPT, and also weaker correlation and more variability in the relationship between visceral fat, change of visceral fat, and gait speed. And finally, this is the last data slide, looking at knee extension, seeing quite a significant increase in that group that was doing the diet and resistance, almost the same, but not quite in the combination group. Loss of knee extension in the group that was doing the dieting and aerobic, and same slight loss in control and diet and aerobic and the knee flexion, and similar improvements. So for this particular trial, this summary, that despite we having a similar 10% weight loss and the visceral adipose tissue and the intramuscular adipose tissue decreased more in that combination group than the other aerobic and resistance group. The visceral adipose tissue and IMAT decreased in all intervention groups more than control. Similarly, the insulin sensitivity increased more in that combination than the other groups. Knee strength more in the combination and resistance than the aerobic. And the weight loss plus combined aerobic and resistance was most effective. So that's what we ended up concluding in the end. So our overall conclusion was really, it is again, as we found in the previous trial, that combination of aerobic and resistance training along with dieting seems to be the most effective for improving metabolic and physical function. So I think the take-home message from what I've shown you today is that, again, it's this combined aerobic resistance. So we hear and you read in the literature that people with sarcopenia and people with frailty should be doing resistance training, but what we're finding is actually this it's a combination of aerobic and resistance, and that if you have someone, and there's always a tricky now conundrum of what do you do if you have a frail, obese, older person, because a lot of the recommendations that are out there for someone who does want to be losing weight is to do some aerobic exercise, go out and do some weight-bearing walking. But what our studies are showing is that that may not be enough to mitigate that loss of lean body mass and hip bone mineral density. So we need to think carefully about that message that we're sending out and what kind of recommendations we're making. So what we are saying is that actually if there is going to be weight loss advised, it should be combined with aerobic resistance exercise to improve physical function and also protect against that bone loss and muscle loss in frail, obese, older adults. I need to acknowledge Dennis Villarreal, who is based at Baylor. He's been instrumental. He's been the person driving the success in these grants, and that's a list of the grants that funded these studies. And also the resources that go into these projects. They are quite labor intensive, so there's lots of research assistants, participants, and the resources that were made available to us through Washington University School of Medicine and the New Mexico Veterans Healthcare System in Albuquerque, New Mexico. That's a picture of the University of Otago in New Zealand, and the bottom picture is the village where I live. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Debra, for your excellent talk and also very convincing data. Thanks so much. May I ask Francesco to go to the podium, please? May I have a question for all of you? Because we are all aging, and Francesco told us that we are declining. So may I ask you, how many of you, have a very protein-balanced breakfast this morning? Who of you has a very balanced protein breakfast this morning? Can you stand up there? Can you leave? Oh, it's not good, not good. And how many of you exercise this morning? Okay, so we have something to do, not only taking care of our patient and thinking, as Francesco said, we have to think when I am giving a lecture of what I will do tomorrow for my patient or the day after, but we have also to think about ourselves. And it is the 5th day that I am in the conference room, and I promise that I need to exercise now. So, now you have questions for you, both of you, and thanks so much for your very, very good talk and encouraging talk. Thanks so much.
Thanks.
So, Indenoi?
Thanks. First of all, thanks, Jean-Pierre. Really thanks for this.
Thank you very much for your nice presentation. I have a question to Francesco. Today you didn't address the protein intake in patients with severe CKD, like CKD stage 4 and 5 without dialysis. Protein intake recommendation for CKD, chronic kidney disease patient, stage 4 and 5 without dialysis. Any consensus in terms of the protein intake for those patients in Europe? We have Japan Nephrology Society only recommend higher protein intake in patients with CKD plus sarcopenia and frailty, but no recommendation, still low protein intake recommendation for patients with severe CKD patient. So I'd like to know the situation in Europe.
I mean, the problem is what do you mean for severe?
Yes.
Because the creatinine clearance is below 20, okay, we have to reduce the protein intake. But instead, I think that now we have a clear demonstration we have not to modify the protein intake. This is not because I say it myself, because it is the evidence that because I remember that 20 years ago, also in Italy, probably also in Asia, we suggest our patients with kidney failure to avoid protein, completely avoid protein. Now it's not true because they're afraid to dialysis. But now we have no evidence that if you eat the right amount of protein, you can go to the set of dialysis. So I think that for sure, we need to adjust the total amount of protein intake, but we are not afraid about the protein intake also in renal failure patients.
Thank you. Any recommendation of HMB in case if you are ready?
I think that you also, I think also in severe renal failure, you can give to your patient the HMB.
Thank you. I have a question to Debra. You found the decrease of bone mineral density after aerobic exercise. Any mechanism? Did you check the vitamin D level of those participants, or any idea to explain the decrease of the bone mineral density after exercise?
Yes, for this particular trial, we are still looking at that data. For the trial, the previous trial where we also saw the decrease even in the combination, we looked at sclerostin to see if maybe it was an unweighting mechanism, and it did seem to have some relationship to that. We have not looked specifically at whether or not the vitamin D levels actually got up to adequate levels. That would be a reasonable thing to look at. I would say, yeah, we've got several markers that we're looking at, but we haven't really, we're not at the point where we can publish a report on that quite yet.
Yes, John.
I have a question to Francesco about HMB. So my understanding is that leucine, if with some small protein, it increases, stimulates the protein synthesis, anabolism, even with a small protein. Protein food, and also plus leucine. Leucine may kind of. So how about even with HMB also increase the protein synthesis with small, even with a small food protein? And next question is, so HMB increases also strength. It's very good. Now, what is the pathogenesis? It's kind of mTOR pathogenesis mechanism. So can you explain the mechanism?
Okay, I'll try to really briefly my answer. First of all, HMB, the experience with HMB started many years ago in the athlete, in the bodybuilder. So because it's you can use also in the Olympic athlete, in the elite athlete, because HMB is not doping. So it's just a metabolite. For sure, if you look for the study, all the study is not alone HMB, is HMB inside of our nutritional supplements with a right amount of protein inside of the same formula. So for sure, it's not so easy always to say that the positive results is just for the HMB, because here is the HMB is inside of a mixes in a formula, not a nutritional supplement. the last thing I always say that if you, is again in clinical practice, if your patient is able to eat enough protein with the usual diet, always we have to suggest usual diet. But when we have the patient with some anorexia, with less food intake, I think that we can put on top these oral nutritional supplements, and in this case, we can prefer the oral nutritional supplements with HMB.
Francesco, may I complete the question by John? When you have a normal or quite normal diet, and you add HMB, at what time do we have to do it, and when the HMB is the most active during the day?
The time during the day,
Yes, ONS, because it's main problem with the nurses.
yeah, sure.
Can you precise it?
Yeah, good question, because I see, I showed you that this is an important question, is the time. In the community, I suggest that it's important to have the synergistic effect with the exercise. So if you expect to do the exercise, for example, at 10 a.m., at the end of exercise, you can eat the HMB or the protein, the fast protein, because it's really important that during the exercise we have acute inflammation, so we have a breakdown, the protein breakdown. So we start with the protein synthesis after 1 hour to stop the exercise. So this is an issue if you have the synergistic. Instead, I think that for oral nutritional supplements, that usually is not so easy for the patient to have a good compliance, just keep the oral nutritional supplements in 3 or 4 parts, one in the middle of morning, one in the afternoon, another one before to go to sleep. I think that the problem is the adherence to the treatment. So in any way, all the strategies to improve the adherence is good.
Sorry, my second question was the HMB can increase muscle strength as well as muscle mass. This was, so how can HMB can increase
The mechanism is to stimulate 3 mechanisms, just to standardize. The stimulates the mTOR, inhibitors in the inflammatory pathway inside of the muscle cell, and also HMB is also able to stimulate the muscle satellite cells. So we have also a myogenesis. So for this reason, we have an improving muscle mass. For this reason, the bodybuilder use the HMB only for the mass, but also for the function.
Yes, please go ahead.
If I can add to that, thanks. The only possible mechanism by which any protein intake could improve strength and function is by improving type 2 fiber size, what you're saying, through myogenesis. Taking in protein intake, anything, you eat whole protein, whey protein, leucine, HMB, that's not going to do anything neurologically, and there's no data to suggest that. So it's only through by increasing type 2 fiber size. And I totally agree with what Francesco was saying. We need to promote a food-first approach, obviously for your lifestyle, but also the ultimate goal is to increase muscle protein synthesis, yeah, when we eat protein. So when you take in a whole protein like chicken, eggs, it's got 9 essential amino acids. When you take in leucine or the metabolite HMB, you don't get as big as bang for your buck protein synthesis-wise as you do by taking in all 9 essential amino acids. But obviously in the settings you're saying, eating all that amount of protein, sometimes it's not feasible, so then you give the next available option, which is leucine or the metabolite HMB. And leucine and HMB both stimulate muscle protein synthesis to the same degree. So I think for preventative of malnutrition, we should be promoting a whole food for protein, not only because it's whole food, but also because it stimulates muscle protein synthesis to a greater degree. And then the next available option is the leucine and the HMB, like you rightly mentioned, or I don't know if you agree with that.
For sure.
Yeah.
I completely agree. It's absolutely true for you and me, or more you, I see your muscle. So it is your experience, but I try to do it, but I'm 56 years age old, so it's just I'm starting to decline, so I really try to avoid this kind of diet. But I completely agree. It's also true for the old people. The problem is especially for the young people. I think that it's so important for everybody that the time of the using HMB or also the protein intake, consider the exercise, because some young people use protein, fast protein, for example, during the exercise. This is a huge mistake, a big mistake, because during the exercise we have a protein breakdown, so we don't need the amino acids in our blood. It's an overweight for our kidney. That's it. That we cannot use. I think that you agree on this.
No, thank you. Completely agree.
I think that we have to have other person to ask questions. Yes, please. Sorry, but we are late in time, so you will discuss with Francesco. You will discuss with Francesco.
Yeah.
Please, go ahead.
Okay, Debra from Hong Kong. I have a follow-up question about protein intake in people with chronic kidney disease, following Alain's question. I will address this question, of course, to Professor Alain. Is it in the literature any evidence-based recommendation for protein intake for people with chronic kidney disease, no matter it's on dialysis or not on dialysis? I suppose no. All these are expert opinion. Am I correct?
No, it's not my opinion. It's in the literature. We have not today. We have no evidence to avoid protein in kidney failure.
Because what I'm trying to say is that if we do not give adequate protein to those CKD patients, we cannot preserve their muscles. I think we need to find an optimal protein level to recommend for these sort of people.
Yes, exactly what I say. I say that not to avoid the protein intake. So you have to give the protein to this kind of patient to avoid it. Also because we have a vicious cycle. If you lose muscle, you improve insulin resistance, and you lose again muscle.
May I intervene? There is a very nice paper by Jürgen Boer, which was published 2 or 3 years ago, which was an international consensus on this topic, precisely. So please go to Boer, 2016, I think, and you will find every data concerning the international consensus on CDK and diet. So another person, it was a question.
I have a question for Dr. Waters. Very beautiful study you presented. The only thing is the bone mass, right? And then you show there's a correlation with body mass. So I'm wondering, if you do the analysis using weight adjusted bone mass, maybe it will show the positive side. In terms of the weight, relatively speaking, the bone mass did not reduce that much, and maybe improve relative to the weight. Because people losing weight, they don't have that much weight to bear.
No, that's a really, really good point, and that's certainly be easy enough to do. And go back and look at that. Thank you for that comment.
Please.
Okay, a question for Debra. Thanks for an excellent talk. I just wanted to ask you about the exercise regime and the sequence of exercise, because it seems to be very carefully choreographed, 15, 30, 30, 15. Is there a rationale for that? And if someone has 1 hour, what would you recommend for the exercise?
Are you talking like a person in the community? Is that your question?
That's right, someone in the community.
Okay. Well, I think it's always important with any kind of exercise program to make sure that you are progressing up slowly, particularly for someone who's sedentary. So you want to have a warm-up component. That's what the flexibility really wasn't at. So a slow amount of warm-up, even 5 minutes of a slower walking speed or something that's going to be lighter weight exercise, followed by the combination of, even if you did 20 minutes, 20-20 of the aerobic and resistance, that would be, if you only had an hour, that would be how we'd split it up. So you'd have 40 and then 60 if you had 5 or 10 minutes on either end. But try to get the balance between the aerobic and the resistance as the main component, and progressing it slowly over a period of months, so people don't start out too high intensity and get a lot of delayed muscle soreness, and then they're reluctant to kind of come back and try again.
With another question here, please.
So I have a question for Dr. Landy, and you've shown that the Dr. Deutsch paper for 10 days bed rest is very impressive result you've shown. So on the other hand, so that could be an elderly people subject case, and on the other hand, you showed that the sarcopenia, pre-sarcopenia is and it could be an onset already in 50s or so. So is that possible to some preventive effect for the pre-sarcopenia or ingesting HIV? Could you expect some profitable point for the preventive for the rather younger pre-sarcopenia generations? HIV is ineffective.
Do you mean during the bed rest for the old people or in the young people?
And you showed the
I showed the data that is the healthy women that for 10 days in the bed rest.
Yeah.
So I think that, again, in clinical practice, if you're thinking about the hip fracture patient, also in the nicest hospital around the world, I think that one day before the surgery and 2-3 days before to start the rehabilitation, considering the pain and the inability to stand up, I think that this is so important in our patient, thinking that in 4 or 5 days, in 10 days, we can lose, our patient can lose more than 10% of the lean body mass.
For 5 or 10 days.
Exactly. And this means that during that period, we are not able to do exercise, any kind of rehabilitation program or a specific exercise. So nutrition, probably during that short period, in perioperative period, is more important than exercise. And we have a demonstration that, for example, with HMB, we can preserve the muscle health. Again, for the young people, but also for the athlete, for the elite athlete, we really don't need to use any kind of integration if you are able to eat in the right way. But this is true also for the Olympic athlete, not only for everybody in this room.
Thank you.
I think that John would like to have a comment.
Well, two things. One, for renal failure. Can you just show me my side? It's not working, so renal failure. Trying to get me out of the door. Okay. With renal failure, if you measure cystatin C, not creatinine, there is no effect of protein on kidney function. The only reason that people believe it's bad is because if you increase muscle function, you increase creatinine. This is life, and this is one of the many false facts that we live with in medicine. It's been there forever. It's very hard to get rid of, but there is a little bit of data showing it's not true. So you should not be afraid of protein, and if a nephrologist is saying, well, you shouldn't do it, measure cystatin C. But I have a real question for you, Francisco. You talked a lot about HMB, and it's the in protein at the moment. When I've looked at the literature, not all that you showed today, but it actually doesn't look like it's any better, maybe slightly worse than the leucine-enriched essential amino acids for its effect. In the United States, HMB is substantially more expensive and has been pushed by Abbott, who sponsor all the studies, compared to now the leucine essential amino acids. Do you think there's any difference between the two types of ways of giving protein? And recently, Shirley Basine basically added protein to people's diet and suggested that you don't need as much if you use dietary protein. He said, it turns out in sarcopenic patients, the 0.8 works just as well if you're doing it as a diet rather than as a supplement. How do you feel about this?
I think, thanks John about this, I think it's really, really important because this means the cost effectiveness and the sustainability of the health care. So also we need to consider the cost. As I said before, I think that also if our patients are able to eat the usual diet, we need and we have to push our patient to the usual diet. But you know that, for example, for the old people, we have a chewing problem, swallowing problem. We have now a cultural problem. I don't know exactly the US, but in Europe, especially in Italy, we have a lot of vegan people. We have a lot of vegetarian people that avoid to eat any kind of animal-derived protein. So I think that this is a little bit a problem. About the difference between using HMB, I show you the briefly the metabolism of using with the KIC enzyme, with the KIC process. And we have evidence that in old people, this KIC doesn't work in the right way. So sometimes probably in the old people could be better to have directly HMB instead of using for this mechanism, because the old people are not able to metabolize all the 5% of using HMB. But I mean, we have no clinical evidence. We have no any study about the comparison between using HMB. I think this is a nice issue, and probably is a little bit, in this case, my dream to compare using to HMB. It never been before. I think that this is really, really important, independent of industry, possibly.
Thank you very much for your question, for your talk, for your question. It was excellent. There is only one point that I would like to raise to Debra and you, Francesco. I am now the new Minister of Health in Geneva, and I have to convince him, and I have also to convince the director of my hospital to use this kind of exercise in the community and oral nutritional supplement in the hospital. How I will do to convince them that I will decrease the money that they are expending. It's a main question for all of us. Excuse me, but you have very nice data. Now we have to convince and to apply it. So for us, you have to exercise and to have balanced diet. But for...
I mean, Jean-Pierre, I think it's really difficult.
I know.
No, it's I mean, what I want to say, it's difficult for the old people, but if you think about the sedentary of our children in the hospital, the sedentary lifestyle. So I think that really we need program to change our mind. We need the TV to say that the sedentary lifestyle, the junky food is bad for the young people, And then we can really try to change our culture. We need to improve the sport. I think that in the US they are so lucky because in the university the sport is considered with a lot of credits. But in Italy, in Europe, in Switzerland, I don't know, in Australia, we not consider the sport in university, in the school. The sport is a secondary discipline. So I think that this issue, I don't know in Asia.
What about
this is
New Zealand?
New Zealand, very sport-oriented, yes.
I mean, in terms of education, consider the sport in terms of education. I think that US is the best around the world about this. But they have a lot of these passion, they have a lot of these subjects.
No, I agree education is key, and we're fortunate in New Zealand to have some very innovative kinds of programs that are actually supported by the government. So we have what's called Accident Compensation Corporation. It is like an insurance company. We have Health Quality Safety Commission, which actually oversees a lot of the programming. We have public health organizations, and we have clinics. So what's going on in New Zealand currently is the government was aware, and I was part of an advisory group, that were lots of strength and balance classes being administered in the community, some by charitable organizations, some by community groups. They've now coordinated that effort by having lead agencies having referrals from GPs for people who are at risk for falls to get put into these classes, and now they're rolling out nationwide. So, yeah, just a different approach.
Excellent, thank you very much. I think that we are running out of time, but please, we will have a very short break to try to keep in time. Thanks so much, goodbye.